Thank you. Good morning. And thanks to Brian for that wonderful contextual laying out the sort of the larger landscape of what today is all about and what this first panel will certainly be picking up in the political economy of workplace precariousness. My role is to be a timekeeper here and keep the proceedings moving and make sure we have ample time for both our presenters and for some discussion today. So I'm David Weil. As an academic, I know a lot about how academics tend to go beyond their time. So that's why I moved to this end of the table. I will be, Michael Link tells me each person, yes, I am into enforcement, that each of our presenters has 15 to 17 minutes. So I have my pieces of paper, I'll slip you. But we have really a wonderful panel here to provide three perspectives on the issue of the political economy of workplace precariousness and really set more of the outlines of what we'll be talking about all day. We started on last night. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to introduce our three speakers all at once and then have them present, and then we'll move into questions and answers and wrap up a little bit before 11 o'clock. So our first speaker is going to be Sheila Block, who is a senior economist and public policy commentator at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Sheila's primary interests are labor markets, fiscal policy, and inequality. She has worked as a political advisor and a public servant in the Ontario government and also as an economist for the labor movement here in Ontario. And there's one of the themes, sub-themes today is the University of Toronto, to which all of our speakers have a connection to. Sheila has a bachelor's in economics from University of British Columbia and a master's in economics from the University of Toronto. Our second speaker will be Raphael Gomez, who is associate professor for employment relations at the University of Toronto and the director of the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. Raphael has a lot of kudos. Most recently, he was awarded the Labor Employment Relations Association Outstanding, John T. Dunlop Outstanding Scholar Award, which has special resonance to me since I was a student of John T. Dunlop, so I know what an honor that is. And Raphael has his BA in economics and political science from Glendon College at York, a master's in economics and a PhD in industrial relations from the University of Toronto. And finally, we'll hear from Wayne Lewchuk. Wayne is a founding member of the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. He's currently the LIUNA Enrico Henry Mancinelli Professor in Global Labor Issues at the School of Labor Studies and the Department of Economics, and also the co-director of a multi-year project looking at poverty, employment, and precarity, so very pertinent to our discussions today. Wayne has a bachelor's and master's in economics from the University of Toronto and a PhD in economics from Cambridge. So we have really a wonderful panel to help us set out this landscape. So with that, let me start with Sheila.
Switch it off? Here we go. Mute and not mute. There you go. So I'm very happy to be with you today to talk about this. And in starting out the panels this morning, I thought I would give you a little bit of context about the labor market conditions in Ontario which is really the kind of landscape against which the labor legislation reform that I think will be a pretty major topic has been taken place. And then I also want to talk about what I see as the real power of labor legislation to actually reduce inequality across a number of factors or a number of vectors. There we go. So if we just step back and start at a real broad context, and we take a look at what's been happening since the turn of this century to the labor market in Ontario. And so if you have two major sectors, goods producing and service producing, you see that employment in the goods producing sector has dropped by almost 10%, while employment in the service producing sector has increased by almost 30%. So a real shift in the labor market and shift in employment. Another backdrop here is the declining union density, which is the share of the labor force that's covered by a collective agreement. And while the blue top line that you see there shows a kind of gentle decline on union density, the green line, which is below it, which is that union density in the private sector, shows a sharper decline. And really over the last 3 years, we've had density of less than 15% in the private sector. And again, for a kind of question of scale or context here, I have a comparison here of union density in the private and public sector along with the share of employment. And so while you have a very healthy union density of over 70% in the public sector, that sector accounts for about 22% or 1 in 5 employees in Ontario. And similarly, with a density of less than 14%, we have the private sector employment that accounts for almost 80% of the total number of employees in Ontario. So in this table, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper in terms of those changes in structure and change in industrial structure that we've been seeing in Ontario. And so what I have there is I have 3 columns: union density, employment growth over that 16-year period, and median wages in 2016. And what's of particular interest, I think, here is that there has been the growth in this low-wage service sector work. And of, I think, particular interest, given what we talked about yesterday, or given what Professor Weil talked with us about yesterday, is the business building and other support services. And that includes cleaning services, that includes security guards, that includes call centers. So a lot of those kinds of jobs that actually are fissured out of those larger firms and go into those smaller firms. And what we see there is really above average employment growth in that sector. That's almost twice the level of total employment growth, and a unionization rate of about 14%. And because that larger industrial category includes waste disposal services, that's actually a little bit of an elevated union density rate than if you were able to pull out that sector. So what we're seeing is growth in these low-wage service sector jobs that outstrips growth of total employment, and that have below average wage rates and below average unionization rates. So if you kind of step from that look since the turn of the century and look at what's happening in 2017, and we did looked at the data for the first 6 months of 2017. And what that tells us is that almost 1 in 4 workers in Ontario is a low-wage worker making less than $15 an hour. And when you combine that with the low union density in the private sector, I think you really see a shift in the role of the Employment Standards Act in the labor market. And so while the Employment Standards Act used to be a floor, which the general labor market rose above, the Employment Standards Act is increasingly setting the wages and the working conditions for a growing number of workers in Ontario. And that increases the importance and the role of that legislation in terms of both getting to levels that are livable or that are appropriate, but also really points to the importance of the act to actually be covering all of the workers who it should be covering. And I think both Leah Vosco and Faye Faraday might be talking a little bit about that in terms of the coverage of the act a little bit later today. So if we look at kind of low-wage work in Ontario and look at the different forms of precarious work, what we see is that workers who are precariously employed in the traditional ways that we describe it, in terms of workers who are seasonal workers, temporary term contract, or in particular casual workers, they are more likely than the average to be working for less than $15 an hour. And in the case of casual workers, which really kind of stands out, almost 60% of casual workers are making $15 or less. Whoop. There we go. I have a typo, which I know is really bad to have among lawyers, so that should be a comma, not a period. It's the problem of sending your slides ahead of time. So the next set of graphs is really going to kind of explore a little bit that marginalized populations are more likely to be working in these low-wage precarious jobs. And so we'll go through that. So again, this is over the first half of 2017. And what that shows us is that Indigenous workers are more likely to be working for less than $15 an hour than the general population in Ontario. And there is a particular interaction of racialization and gender that leaves us with the fact that women who identify as First Nations are working for less than $15 an hour or low wages at a rate of 36%. Again, comparing the total population to that 23% figure. There is similar data for recent immigrants. And so again, recent immigrants are more likely to be working for minimum wage. And when you take that combination of immigration status and gender, fully 42% of women who are recent immigrants are working for $15 or less an hour in the first half of this year. So to look at the situation for racialized workers, because of some data complications that I will spare you, we have to flip back to 2011. And what that shows us is, again, that interaction of racialization and gender. So if you're a racialized man, you're more likely to be working for minimum wage than if you're non-racialized man. If you are a racialized woman, you are more likely to be working for minimum wage than non-racialized women, than racialized men, or than non-racialized men. So again, there is this unequal distribution of this low-wage work. So to try and step back from these pieces and to try and step back from looking at the changes in the structure of employment over the last number of years, and to also step back from some of the details of this, what I want to take you through is some work that I did looking at changes in the incomes of families with children over the first 15 years, over the last 15 years, or the first 15 years of this century. And so we have a consistent measure of families with children under the age of 18. What I was looking at is real income growth over a number of different definitions of income. And we did this on a decile analysis. So what that does is you take the entire population, you divide it into 10 equal groups by income, and then you look at what the outcome was. So the first thing that I looked at was earnings. And so what that is clearly telling us is that there are two labor markets in Ontario, as had been suggested earlier by the speaker. And that first labor market, for the top half of families, is actually working quite well, seeing gains in real incomes. But the bottom half of those families are in fact suffering from these economic conditions and are really losing ground. So the next income definition that we looked at was total income. And so what that includes is transfers from government. It also includes other forms of income in terms of dividends and those kinds of income. And what you see here is a really crucial role of government in the bottom half of the income distribution to mitigate those impacts of labor market inequality and to try and maintain the incomes of families, of low-income families. And then the final measure there is after-tax income. So after-tax income is after tax, but it also includes capital gains, which is not included in total income, which I will spare you the details of that. And I think what that really shows us is that the tax and transfer system, while it was successful in kind of supporting low-income families, was not actually doing a very good job of redistribution. And the reason it wasn't is that after-tax incomes was actually growing more quickly than total income for those top half of families. Okay, all you lawyers have been like staying with me in the numbers and the graphs really well. Pandering to the audience, I have the scales of justice here. And so, because I know it's, this isn't necessarily your home territory here. So when we want to step back and think broadly and think about what are the kinds of tools that governments have to mitigate this kind of inequality, and there are really sort of two sets of tools. The first is referred to sometimes as pre-distribution. And what it really is aimed at doing is changing market outcomes. So it can redistribute income from high income earners to lower income earners. It can redistribute income from profits or capital to labor. And it's really changing market outcomes. And the second group of policies is redistribution. And redistribution is using the tax and transfer system to both increase incomes of lower income individuals or families and to redistribute that income after the market has done its work from high income earners to lower income earners. And I guess I would think that there are, while we saw in the last graph that transfers have done a really important job in Ontario over this century, I think I would argue that the anti-tax environment that we are all baking in and cooking in really limits the effectiveness and the ability of governments to act on policy to do that kind of redistribution. And you can see that even with governments that have a kind of policy openness, like our current provincial government or like our current federal government, to acting on inequality. They actually have limited capability, and an indication of this mindset is one of the first things that the new federal government did to reduce inequality was reducing income tax rates, which is reducing the potential of your most progressive tax base to raise revenues. So there are those kinds of limitations. In terms of actually taxing high income earners, particularly at a subnational government, there are real limitations because there's a real temptation for high income earners to either move their income into other jurisdictions or to move themselves into it. So I'm not saying it's not an important tool, but I think there really are limitations. So that's why I am kind of particularly excited about the potential of labor law reform to do this. First, it shifts income from profits or capital to labor. And when Galen Weston, who is the CEO of Loblaws, was on a call to the investment community, he very clearly identified, in a kind of factual basis, that the increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour would have an impact on the bottom line, and that was because it would be shifting the income earned from profits to labor. But it's not only along the kind of vector of income inequality that there's such potential for this labor law reform. Because racialized workers, because recent immigrants, because Indigenous workers are more likely to be working in low-wage work and more likely to be in precarious employment, there is huge potential of these kinds of labor law reforms to decrease inequality along those other factors. And I think you'll probably be talking about it later today, but this isn't only about minimum wage. That's what's kind of easier for me to graph. Where am I at? Okay, I'm good. This is also about improving the quality of work in terms of scheduling, in terms of paid leave, and in terms of equal pay provisions. And I don't want to leave out in my last 90 seconds the enormous importance of the easier access to unionization, or people being able to make that decision. Because I think, as all of you know probably much better than me, rights that are not enforceable are really of no value. And there is nothing like having a union representation in your workplace to actually be aware of your rights, to have the protections to get them enforced, and to have the resources in terms of legal and other staff to actually make those effective. And then finally, just in terms of, it's not only around violations of employment standards, but in terms of other rights, in terms of human rights and others, that unionization provides easier access to remedies for gender and racial discrimination than you would have in a non-union workplace. So I want to leave you that both of these tools are really effective and potential in reducing income inequality, but I really think that labor legislation and labor reform has a tremendous possibility. Am I good? Okay, thank you.
Take your mic.
Sheila has set the standard for both content and timeliness, so Raphael.
Oh boy, thank you so much. Hard to follow almost a perfect delivery, perfect talk. One thing I will say is when labor lawyers invite 3 non-lawyers, you're going to probably get a lot of data. So I'm gonna follow in Sheila's footsteps, but it'll be a different take, but a very complementary approach. I just want to say a couple of things just before I start. I was invited here by Michael 14 years ago, so that would have been probably the 2nd or 3rd annual lecture, and it kind of defined my career at the time. I think I was starting out, and the theme back then, 14 years ago, was on non-standard work, and so that took me in a whole different direction. So you can see how these things percolate. 14 years, we were probably the only people in this room who were interested at the time, but I think it's had an influence. And I want to thank you and the organizers, John and Craig, for doing this again. I also wanted to say thank you to my co-author. So this is the title of our talk, Sean O'Connor, who's sitting there. I wouldn't have had the paper draft written or this presentation ready had not Sean helped me co-author this. So we're titling this talk, A Bridge Too Far, because I want to pick up on Sheila's comment about the Employment Standards Act. It's very much become not a minimum standard upon which everything else is negotiated upward through the kind of standard employment relationship that used to exist in the early days of the post-war period. Rather, it is the defining document that creates the standards. So it's in effect the collective agreement for the non-unionized workforce. And what I'm going to talk about, what we're going to mention, is this idea of enforcing that contract, which, as we know, a collective agreement is only as good as its enforcement, and why we've developed and organized systems inside of the traditional Wagner Act model to ensure that collective agreements are enforced. There's always a potential for drift away from what the language of the contract says, and unless you have informed, active individuals, even those contracts aren't enforced often. So imagine a workforce that doesn't have those same rights and potential to enforce these systems. That's the general and generic theme of the talk. And so what we're going to propose is an actual model that might redress this enforcement gap. So let's begin then with the model that prevails in the unionized sector, which we know is the Wagner Act model. There are many, of course, benefits that have come from the Wagner Act model. So I think one of the issues I want to disclose up front is we're not proposing an elimination or a substitution with the Wagner Act model. Rather, it's sort of importing some of the good elements or the important elements of the Wagner Act into the non-union sector, which, as we've seen, is just grown. And to make it sort of more visible, you'll see ways in which we've just taken existing data and relabeled it to sort of show you the importance of a reinterpreted Wagner Act for the non-union sector, which might actually have these very tangible benefits of enforcing the standards that are being expanded in many cases across the country in Employment Standards Act laws. So many benefits. The key benefit I would say about the Wagner Act model, which differentiates it from Europe, is also its weakness. It's workplace-based. And so once you get a union inside a pretty established workplace in North America, unless that establishment closes strategically, perhaps to eliminate the possibility of unionization, or through some eventual technological change or shift in markets, it closes down. Absent those two elements, a union sticks. And so one of the things that happens is very few workplaces that eventually get organized under the Wagner Act model truly become decertified in the sense of eliminating a union. We know decertifications happen, but they're often switches to a different union and so on. So workplace Wagnerism is very strong at the establishment level, something that in Europe was always historically very weak, which is why they developed different systems to give voice at the workplace, because their structures were more at a higher level, sectoral, industrial agreements, and left workers without much voice at the workplace. So Wagner kind of had two of these elements in one: strong workplace representation and durability. But unfortunately, it stopped covering enough workers. We saw the data that Sheila presented. And I think that's the big deficiency, especially in the private sector, where we're now approaching numbers that the US was at 20 years ago, when people were sounding warning bells about union density, which is now in the single digits in the private sector in the United States. So I think this is what we have to take account of when we measure up the Wagner Act model and how it's performing today. So there's a shortfall. I think we know, and we've seen the numbers. 15% in the private sector are organized through the traditional Wagner Act model. So flip it around. Let's start thinking of another number. 85% are essentially only covered by Employment Standards Act type laws. So if you kind of go with that idea, that's our starting premise, then you see the importance of how do you enforce then, essentially, the collective agreement for the non-standard workforce. So here's the key revelatory number. This top line is the recalibration of the private sector non-unionized workforce. So in the private sector, those covered only by Employment Standards Act. This goes back to 1976 when we had something called Kalura data that told us who was unionized or not. And then in the mid-90s, we had labor force survey data that sort of captured who was unionized and not. We have a pretty consistent data set going back more than 40 years, or just over 40 years. This is the key line, I think, for us to look at. It's the importance, the growing importance of ESA only. And we should add that the 70s were also different, because as David mentioned and was alluded to Sheila, the standard employment relationship, that kind of janitor who worked for GM, had better working conditions than the janitor today. So even though we still had a majority of non-unionized private sector employees covered by ESA, that was sort of a titular coverage rate, because the firms themselves wanted to be employers of choice. And so you tended to have better working conditions in a Kodak or in a GE family. That's gone today. So that's an important statistic to look at. Public sector unionization, we know, is very robust. It's roughly 5 times greater in each of our countries, the US and Canada. Only 5 times greater than the private sector rate. Only that the private sector rate in the US has collapsed, and the American unionization rate is in the 30s. Ours is in the 70s in the public sector. So I don't think we have to worry too much about the public sector. So this is really a talk and an idea that's localized and framed for the private sector. So then you break it down as was done by Sheila. So these are people who are covered now only by ESA. And all this is a kind of relabeling of the union density numbers. And you see young people are highly dependent on Employment Standards Act coverage. And as probably Wayne knows very much, because he's looked at the health and safety and the health and welfare of workers, the precarity and the risk to young people in their first employment experiences is very high. Mortality rates are much higher for younger workers. In part, I think, because they're essentially absent any union voice inside of workplaces. 9 out of 10 right? This is now in this solid line is the 1997 numbers, and these are the 2017 numbers. But essentially, they've stuck pretty high and pretty tight for younger workers. 9 out of 10 young workers don't have a union in their kind of first job experience, reliant only on ESA and health and safety, which without a voice inside the workplace is often not enforced, those standards. And you get it with education. So again, these lines reflect different years, and the top line is today, 2017. You can see that all age groups now are more likely to be covered by Employment Standards Act only, with no union coverage. That's the insight here. But again, it's your less educated workforce that is more likely to be only covered by Employment Standards Act than more highly educated. But there has been a fanning up across all educational categories. So the ESA is becoming the default system for employment standards and rights for most private sector workers. Another interesting dimension, the last figure that we'll show you, is by workplace size. So look at this. This is the number of workers. Sorry, the number of workers is listed here. So this is your small, medium-sized employers. In very small employers, it's, again, 9 out of 10 workers are reliant on ESA coverage only. But look over here, the larger employers, you know, this was back in the 90s, 60%, because this is 40% covered by ESA only, that would have meant 60% were covered by some collective agreement. So unions have been very successful in organizing large employers. The thing is, the trend towards, in the Wagner Act model, is you set up a firm. By definition, a new firm is always voice-free, union-free, and tends to be smaller. So new workplaces haven't adhered to the norms that were maybe set in the post-war period around collective bargaining. Therefore, as they've grown, they've shed the need for sort of unionized collective agreement. So even in large employers, you've seen a growth in ESA-only coverage. Having said that, half of the workers who are in large employers have access to collective bargaining. And that sets a precedent for non-unionized workplaces too. So large employers tend to conform and also match wages and working conditions in the unionized sector. So we're really not concerned, I think, with people working in larger firms necessarily. It's at the smaller, so the medium and smaller size where the prevalence of ESA only, the absence of any union counterpoint on which to benchmark your own employment practices is, I think, a very, very important thing to highlight. So, quoting our speaker and our chair, this is one thing that was a real revelation. You know, before your publication of the Fishered Workplace, you started on this idea of enforcement long before as well. Many people had looked at it. There's a tendency to think of new laws as expanding rights, but until you're enforcing the laws you've passed, you're perhaps missing an opportunity. As we know, the political cost to sometimes expanding legislation is very high, whereas enforcing existing rights, I think, comes with less of a political challenge. And I think that was David's key insight back in the mid-2000s when he was writing about this. So where are we going with this? I think the key insight from the success of the Wagner Act model has been its ability to translate those effectively bargained rights at the establishment level and translate them with a system of voice for workers. And what we have growing with the prevalence of non-unionized workers in the private sector is a much more demanding role for the guardians of those standards, which essentially are our Ministry of Labor officials and inspectors, notwithstanding the growth of nonprofit activist groups that also help support those workers, the Workers' Action Center and so on. But those are, I hate to say it, drops in the bucket when you think about the 300,000 establishments that exist across the province. That's the numbers in Ontario. And if you have 85% of those establishments in the private sector not unionized, that's a huge number. So your enforcement capabilities, if you're relying on external enforcement, will always be playing catch-up to any slack or lack of enforcement inside of the labor market. So what's the big idea? It's not a big idea. It's been around for a long time. Proponents of this, or variants of this idea, have been around for a while. You're probably very well familiar with Professor Paul Weiler, who 30 years ago also thought of this role. Back then, unionization rates in the US were still about 20% overall, and much higher in the private sector. But even then, it was a very important issue. But it was this idea of a system for entrenching employee voice where traditional certification is very hard. Think of those employment situations that have 50-person establishments. You know, unions can tell you, the organizing community can tell you how costly that is to an organization to spend the effort to organize a 50-person workplace when the odds of organizing are less than 50-50. And then you know, across one graph that we could have shown, and Sheila probably has this data, but wages track very closely to employment size. So as you get smaller, wages go down. So those are low-wage, small-numbered workplaces which are only financed through the dues that are then collected. It becomes hard to sustain an organizing model, which is why unions have been so successful in larger workplaces. It's just we don't have as many of them in the new economy. So I think to rely on a successful organizing strategy alone through the union movement that doesn't have any foundation within an organization is a very tall order to ask of our trade unions. And what, to borrow a metaphor that Harry Arthurs has often used, is sort of the training wheels for unionization have to be reestablished. And so through a workplace committee, which, you know, in the early 90s, there was a lot of direct application of the Works Council model. Even the language, you know, was used. We need Works Councils. Let's bring them into Canada and North America. I think there's some naivete because those ideas were pretty foreign to the way our systems work. And the fact, this is something that only occurred to me upon visiting Germany and studying Germany, is that they never really had an Employment Standards Act in the same way we think of it. Why? Historically, 70–80% of people were covered by negotiated agreements. Industry agreements that were also split by region, negotiated between employer federations and union federations. So the space for an Employment Standards Act that covered people who weren't part of unionized agreements was very small. It's only now that that coverage rate has gotten to about 50% that Germany is thinking of having employment standards style legislation. They enacted their first minimum wage only this past year. So what did they have instead? They had a system of works councils, because framework agreements, industry agreements are great at setting wages and benefits, but provided little voice at the workplace. So there was an institution that developed out of their circumstances and their particular histories. So I don't think a works council, in the same way that it's designed in a Germany or now across many European countries, is saleable. And I guess the proof is that for 30 years, it's gone nowhere. So what is our suggestion? Well, we have noted the spectacular rise in the number of people who are covered only by ESA-type legislation. And as was mentioned, these aren't just the minimums that no one pays attention to, because we've already got better working conditions inside these lovely corporate structures. Rather, these are the collective agreements for the non-standard workforce, or the non-unionized workforce. And we already have a model within North America. It was actually pioneered here in Ontario in the realm of health and safety, which, in addition to external inspections, in addition to enforcement and penalties, the establishment of committees whereby workers become informed of their rights and obligations is a mandated. So thing in Germany, works councils, which again I was naively thinking they were mandatory, they're not, they're voluntary. They're very easy to set up. 2 or 3 employees can ask and request, depending on the size of a workplace, can request one. But even there, we've seen that there's employer opposition. And so it's very hard now to form a works council in some new employers. So what we think would work in our context is an employment standards equivalent to the Health and Safety Committee. A place where workers can form and be informed of their rights and obligations, especially over the kind of core elements of the ESA, and can therefore be also a training ground for people with collective representation in those skills. It's often hard to organize in a certification route where workers have had no experience with collective voice at all. So employment standards committees would be modeled on the Joint Health and Safety Committee. I think it's possible that in some cases, when you establish a committee, you might be thwarting another channel by which workers could perhaps organize. But I think given the evidence of where ESA only prevails, it's likely that this would be the stepping stone, the training wheel towards full-blown Wagner Act style organizing, which I think ultimately creates better working conditions and a better economy for all. And just I wanted to point to you, why do we think we need this? This is, by the way, the detail. It's meant to be hard to read. This was the scheduling provisions that were brought in under Bill 148. Now, you're all trained in law, so for you it's probably elementary and simple. But I'd ask you to present this to one of the vulnerable workers that we're talking about, recent immigrants, young workers, and tell them to enforce this at their workplace. I would imagine it'd be very difficult. But if this was given to a committee of workers who are trained, maybe by ministry officials, maybe even with support from trade unions and nonprofit groups, I think there'd be a chance of provisions like this actually having an opportunity to be enforced and legitimizing the great efforts that went into these reviews. Because I think a large amount of work and study and careful deliberation went into this, but like any contract language, you need people on the ground to enforce it. And you need a procedure, as was mentioned by Brian, to address disputes. So I think that's the key kind of cornerstone of our paper and approach, and one which I'm now told to sit down. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael.
I left it here.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. Well, you've had two fascinating presentations. I need to forewarn you that I'm actually an economic historian. So when I think about solutions, I don't think about what we can do next year. I think about what we can do in the next 2 or 3 decades. So that allows me to be both perhaps more ambitious, but also in some ways perhaps less realistic. But that's life. So the work I'm going to be presenting, this is work that's very much a joint effort by a number of scholars and by United Way Toronto York Region, who's been my partners for the last 7 years now. And we've been looking at the issue of how the changing nature of labor markets is affecting not only workers, but also affecting households and communities. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is how the spread of precarious employment is influencing a broader set of variables than just how much money you make or whether you can have standards enforced, but also whether you can have a family, whether you can start children, or whether you can become engaged in your community. And I think we need to think of it in those broader terms because many of the social problems I think we're seeing out in our communities today reflect struggles with young people starting families, with people being integrated into their communities, and with families being sustainable. So let me I'm going to go back. So the data I'm going to present it's drawn from 2 surveys that we've done, 2011, 2014, and we've now got just over 8,000 individuals in our Hamilton, Toronto database. But there's also been a similar survey done here in London. We're waiting to see some of those results come out. And Peterborough and St. Catharines have done similar surveys. And Vancouver has just come on board, and they're now planning one as well. So we're going to have a much larger data set to begin to understand what's going on. I want to start by sort of addressing, in some ways, the elephant is in the room, which I think some people might be asking. I mean, is this dated? I mean, why are we talking about work? I mean, isn't everyone telling us there isn't going to be any work, right? Artificial intelligence is going to come and end everyone's job. And, you know, I think one has to be very cautious there because there's been a long, long history of very smart people predicting this for centuries. So Benjamin Franklin, back in the 1700s, was foreshadowing the 4-hour work week. that was eminent. Right? That hasn't quite happened. George Bernard Shaw, I mean, he became more modest in the 1800s. He was talking about the 2-hour workday. That would really be lovely. And John Maynard Keynes, certainly one of my favorites and certainly an important figure in economics, it wrote in 1930, he predicted a 75% reduction in hours worked in his lifetime. And again, I think most of us understand that that didn't happen. Now, I think it would be quite lovely if artificial intelligence eliminated most work. I mean, you know, I think getting rid of a lot of work would be a good idea. It would be excellent. I think it's not going to happen. I think the more likely scenario, because that doesn't mean that artificial intelligence is not going to change the nature of work. It is going to have profound effects. This is a very bad time to learn to be a truck driver or to be a taxi driver. And perhaps it may also be a very bad time to learn to be a lawyer as well. Because certainly artificial intelligence is encroaching on those kinds of jobs as well as others. But I think the future is not likely a world without work. It's likely a world in which work is increasingly precarious, poorly paid, and without benefits. And so I think what we're seeing today is a foreshadowing of the impact of artificial intelligence on the future of work. And so we had better be very conscious of what's happening in the work world and how we might change it. So some of the questions I want to look at and just really touch on in my 15 minutes plus 2 are how are labor markets changing? What's the role of precarious employment in this? Who are the precariously employed? And what are the social and economic costs? So I think the first point that we need to understand is labor markets are no longer working the way they used to. The labor market of today is not the labor market of our parents and certainly not the labor market of our grandparents. And it's not working in the way that I was taught as an undergraduate economics student at University of Toronto, or MA student, how the labor market was supposed to work. Because the labor market was supposed to work if productivity went up, wages went up, right? And while I was an undergraduate, some time ago back here, let's see if I can, do we have a electronic, oh here it is. So I mean this is actually how it used to work. When productivity went up, because this is the graph of net productivity from 48 to the mid 70s, hourly compensation went up, and that's, you know, that's what I was trained, and I sort of struggled through all those equations and figured it out, and it seemed to make sense, and I was actually somewhat even convinced. Of course, we didn't have this graph back when I was an undergraduate. Had we had it, then I would have questioned that process, because since the mid-1970s, productivity, that's how much we produce per person, has continued to grow almost unchanged. There's a few blips, but you can see what's happened to hourly compensation. It has flatlined. In some ways, this is the microeconomics of the macroeconomics that David presented to us yesterday. And so really, since the mid-1970s, the average worker is producing probably twice as much as they did in the mid-70s, but they're paying exactly the same as they were being paid in the mid-70s. And so what we have is the phenomena is that our society has continued to get richer, but most of us don't feel rich. And the reason for that is, as David pointed out, most of that gain in productivity has gone to the top 10 or the top 1%. So I think the first message here is that whatever we do in the future, we need to sort of figure out how to recapture those productivity gains for the general population, because that's not where they're going. And certainly, my sense is that artificial intelligence is going to allow that light blue line, the net productivity line, to continue to grow. Perhaps we're actually going to see a kink in that line, and it's going to start going straight up. But that's not going to be very helpful if we can't figure out how to change the hourly compensation line. I think there's a lot of evidence that there's a problem there. And so this is, of course, the outcome of that graph. This is the Canadian data that's comparable to what David presented yesterday. This is the share of income going to the top 1% in Canada over 1920 to 2010. And you can see that back in the robber baron period, they were getting 15 to 16% of everything we produced. That fell down. By the 80s, it reached about 7%, and it now has returned to about 14 or 15%. So again, we're back to where we were in the 1920s, before there were unions, before there was public education, before there was public health care, in terms of who's getting the benefits of the productivity growth of the last 40 or 50 years. So one of the issues that our group addressed quite immediately is exactly what is precarious employment? What are its characteristics? And from the very beginning, we made a distinction between precarity and poverty. Right? So, and I think it's important to understand that two things are going on. There have always been low-paid jobs. So there's always been people in jobs that didn't provide enough to sustain their living. What has really changed over the last 40 years is a dramatic increase now in jobs which are also insecure in a way that perhaps they weren't 30 or 40 years ago. And those two things interact, and I guess our point is that there are many jobs that are precarious and low paid. There's certainly a correlation there. But there are also many low paid jobs that are not precarious, and there are many precarious jobs that are not low paid, right? I bet you some of them work in law offices or at universities. So when we think about precarious employment, this is what we think about. We think about temp agencies, and we think about staffing agencies and providing people on short-term contracts. And if you're really more up to date, you think of some of these online platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk or Clickworker, where you sit at your computer and you do these tasks. And work has now been divided into 5-minute, 10-minute, half-hour, 1-hour bits, and you string these together, and that's supposed to be a job. And the one that I like is this. This is Welcome to Fiverr. Of course, this is an American site, so this should be Sixer if it was in Canadian dollars. But for $5, they can actually train you to be a Paul McCartney, right? You can learn to be a guitar player for $5 or $6 if you're in Canada. And the vision of work here is one where people are at their computers, they're doing this work, and perhaps if they're lucky, they're sitting on the beach with their computer and they're stringing together these 5-second or 10-second or 15-cent jobs, and eventually they're going to have a career, but they're going to be able to soak up the sun as well. Certainly the research that we've done suggests that is not the reality, and I don't think that is the future, although that may have some attractions. So this is one of the pieces of data that's caught the eye of a number of folks from our study, and this looks at where are people employed. So this is based on 2014 data from the Toronto Hamilton labor market, and we divided this basically by the form of the employment relationship. But you know, what's the legal structure of that job look like? And we divided it into our gold pile. These are people who are in standard employment relationships. They have permanent, full-time jobs with benefits. Permanent means they expect to have that job at least in a year. They have one employer, and they get something other than a wage, maybe a pension, maybe some health benefits, not necessarily everything. And so only about half of that labor market, these are people ages 25 to 65, so students have been dropped out, retirees have been dropped out, are in those kind of jobs. The other half are in something else. So about 10% are in permanent part-time work, about 20% are in forms, are working through temp agencies, or on 6-month contracts, 1-year contracts, etc. But it's this rose-colored slice, the quarter, 23%. These are folks who said, I'm in a permanent full-time job. But permanent in quotations. They didn't know if that job was going to last for a year. They weren't getting anything other than a wage. So they were paid a wage, but they didn't get any benefits. And to me, that's a sign the employer really doesn't intend for this to continue on indefinitely. So we wanted to understand better what is going on in that half of the graph, and particularly what's going on amongst that quarter who are not in a standard employment relationship, are not working through a temp agency, but are telling us they have permanent full-time employment, but they seem to be different. And so in order to do that, we developed the Employment Precarity Index. And it's really a simple task. It takes 10 questions, and really the root of this is Leah Vosko, a project she started back when she was at Mac, and then she moved on to York. And I got attached to it. I was quite happy studying auto workers, but then I realized they were becoming a thing of the past, so I better change markets and start looking at precarious workers. And I did that thanks to Leah, so 20 years later, here we are. So we took these 10 questions from our survey, and we simply created an index from 0 to 100. And if you answered yes to all of those questions on the left, well, then you were in the precarious category. And if you answered no, then you were in the secure category. And so we divided our 8,000 people into 4 bits, from secure, the 25% with the lowest scores, to the precarious, the 25% with the highest scores, and looked at what was it like to work in some of those different areas. One thing you'll note is we don't include income in this. And we did that consciously so we could look at the interaction between low pay and insecurity and see what's going on. And I won't go into that in detail because I have even fewer than 15 minutes now. So first of all, using this, who are the precariously employed? So this looks at the 25% of our 8,000 people, the 2,000 people who scored the highest on our index, answered the yes to the most number of those questions. And there's some surprises here. I mean, not surprising. Most of our temp agency workers were in that precarious group. Most of our short-term workers, people who are employed for 3 months or a week or a year, are in that group. The most prevalent group in there are freelancers. These are own account self-employed. And that's a very rapidly growing type of employment. And they're often on their own. They're doing work that used to be done by full-time employees. Now they're doing it freelancing. They're working as editors at newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. Our permanent part-time workers are here, about 15%. But fully 1/4 of our precarious group told us they're in permanent full-time employment. And I think this really speaks to what David was talking about yesterday, that with the fissured workplace, there are a lot of jobs that look permanent, but they're having the characteristics of insecurity and precarity. And probably that is really where the most rapid growth is in terms of precarious employment. Because if you actually look at the official statistics and the growth of temporary work and short-term work and freelancing work, there's barely been a change since 2000, right? And that's used by a lot of people who say, well, nothing has changed, and yeah, Lewchuk, you're another one of those left-wing lunatics. You don't know what's going on. But it just seems to me incomprehensible to think that there hasn't been a change in the economy since 2000, given what we hear. So what does all of this mean? And I'm going to skip through to some of the findings. Well, it means if you're in precarious employment, 25% in the bottom, versus secure, the 25% who scored the lowest in the index, you're paid less, and you live in households that earn less. So precarity is not just an individual thing, it is a family thing as well, and it spreads to the family. If you're in precarious employment down here, you're less likely to have a pension, you are less likely to have benefits, so you have more insecurity. It's not just low wages. These other things are on your wicket if you have to face them. If you miss work, you're not being paid. So again, you have that insecurity. If you're sick or whatever, or you need to take care of something, you're not getting paid. Very different from those in secure employment. Oops. This is, I think, quite important. Training. If you are in this precarious group, the 25% down here, you are much less likely to be getting employer-paid training, only 17% versus 56% up here. But you're much more likely to have to pay for your own training, 28% versus 10%. So the burden of training is now transferred onto these workers who are in these insecure and often low-paid positions. And, of course, fewer of them have voice. Only 12% of our precarious group had voice versus 34% of our secure. So what are the social implications? And this is where I want to finish up and then speculate a little bit about where we might go. So our research really focuses on issues. What is this doing to families? Can they form relationships? Can they start families? What's it doing to communities? How do they volunteer? Does it lead to social isolation? And the news here is just not good. So this is looking at impact of precarious employment on forming relationships and starting a family. And this is only for people in our sample under age 35. Right? So these are for millennials. And what you can see, there's a fundamental difference. If you're a millennial in a secure job, you haven't delayed forming a relationship. If you're a millennial in a precarious job, a quarter of them said, yes, I've delayed even having a relationship. I just don't know what my schedule is. I don't know if I have the money to start up a relationship, and they're not forming them. Delaying children, the same phenomena. If you're in secure employment, about 11% saying, yeah, I'm delaying starting a family because of employment, but fully over a quarter of the precarious are doing that. So the decline of our population growth rate is in part a reflection of the change in the nature of our employment relationships. This looked at what's the relationship between precarious employment and what's going on in the household. And here we asked about whether or not the employment situation created anxiety at home. And again, you can see there's a very big difference. Yeah, home life is anxious, and there's always an issue. So 20% of our secure group said, yeah, my employment creates anxiety at home. But almost half of those in precarious employment have anxiety at home. So the children maybe want something. You're saying, well, I don't know if I can send you to camp or buy that hockey stick. or whatever you're asking for, because I don't know if I'm going to have a job in 6 months. And so there's anxiety at home as a result of the relationship. So to close out, so this is sort of one vision of what the world of work might look like with some of the new technology, AI, computer-assisted learning, etc. But I'm going to suggest, I think we need something different. And we've heard already 2 suggestions how we make that change, and they're important. We do need better labor standards. There is absolutely no doubt. We need to raise the minimum wage. But that's just not good enough. I don't think we want a population where my kids or your kids, that is their life, working at the standards implied by minimum labor standards. We need clearly more. And we also know there's problems with enforcement. As David said, you've got 1,000 inspectors to do the United States. Well, come on, let's get real. And how are we going to do that? And so the second leg of that is what Raphael talked about, which is having unions, right? So you have people in the workplace, an organization in the workplace that can enforce these standards. And again, absolutely important and something that we need desperately. But I would suggest there's a third leg, and it comes back to that graph where I showed productivity going up, wages being flat. We need to capture the real wealth that's out there, that's now being captured by a very small part of the population. And to me, at least, that does mean a different role for the state in the future. That means the provision of public goods, whether it's child care, which is a massive problem for the precarious, whether that means a pharmacare drug plan, which again is a massive problem for low-wage workers, whether that means provision of schooling, university education, public parks, public transportation. These are all things that are needed. But on top of that, I do think we need a way to get money into the hands of people to spend on things that aren't covered by those social things that we clearly need. And I think there we do need to be thinking about basic income and how that gives people an option to exit as well from workplaces where the employer is not providing what we would consider to be a human and decent standard of living. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wayne. And those were really 3 wonderful presentations. I think we've gone from Brian giving us the international perspective, and then the national perspective, and then 3 really insightful papers about how these trends are playing out here in Ontario. I think really gives us a lot to talk about. We have about 10 minutes? 15 minutes. So what I'd like to do is get some questions. If you'll tell us who you are and then give us your questions, and maybe we'll capture a few and maybe do 3 at a time. So. Thank you. Let me get a couple more, and then we'll let our panelists respond. And you don't have to be from the University of Toronto to speak. Just
listening to you and listening to Raphael about your proposed solutions, and Raphael and I have a long-standing debate about the best way to improve enforcement and helping us understand that. And while I recognize the important point that Wagner was making about the link between reuse structures and enforcement, I'm worrying quite a bit about the institutionalization of a kind of worker council model, partly because of the parallels that we see in the occupational health and safety which you said a lot. And then your piece on precarious employment is still makes me really a little bit more. So I just wonder how you would respond in terms of trying to institutionalize better enforcement that introduces the kind of baby steps that
Okay, maybe one more and we'll. Andy. Why don't we go down the line and let you each respond?
Yeah, I'll pass the mic down. So I'll try to touch on all of the questions that had some relation to our talk. With respect to sort of joining up Leah and Joanna's remarks, yeah, I think Unifor's community chapters are, in a sense, that, providing places where non-unionized workers can get counsel, help, support, information, even if they're not interested in organizing, but rather have problems at the workplace. You know, Unifor can do that. It's a huge organization. The merger of two of Canada's largest unions has made it possible. And I think it'll be viable in communities like Windsor, which have had deep roots, long histories, still a pretty large unionization rate. But if you go out of those places with strong union traditions, I think you're going to miss a lot of workers in the non-unionized sector. And with respect to the problems inherent in health and safety committees, I'd say yes. Any human institution that's ever been created is imperfect. But I would think that what the research has shown, it's the interaction effect of unions and health and safety committees that does enormous amounts to boost health and safety outcomes in workplaces. In other words, the two institutions working in concert is what really makes a difference. And I don't think, both in theory and in practice, you can argue that empowering workers with more knowledge, with more rights, is ever going to lead to a worse outcome that would have prevailed in the absence of those institutions. But I would say yes, preference would be given to a full-blown independent union with certified bargaining rights, where you can talk about the whole terms and conditions of work, by all means, that's the place you want to go. But in the current institutional system, it's not happening, and it won't ever happen, given the Wagner Act model and tendency to be built around large establishments and large workplaces. So I think you need an in-between model. There are other approaches that have been talked about, minority union models, which are kind of similar. If you get enough workers who are interested in a union, they lose the vote 49% to 51. Why should they get nothing? Why should they be left with zero representation? Why wouldn't they have access to some benefits of unionization? Maybe consultation rights, maybe bargaining over terms and conditions of work, not over wages, but something in between. That could also be a model that could be used. It just seems unfair to 85% of private sector workers that they have recourse to no collective voice in their workplace. And mind you, the benefits to employers of getting information from workers is quite high. And another reason why you get so few decertifications pushed by employers is they live with collective bargaining and realize over time the benefits that that can bring. So I'm with you. It's not a perfect institution, not a perfect solution, but doubling our inspectors is still, in Ontario, from 150 to maybe 300. We have 300,000 establishments in this province, many of which, won't ever be touched by an inspection regime. So we need something else to complement that system and to help unions organize where voice and collective representation has been largely absent. Oh, you have a mic.
So I'll just briefly add that I think along with what Raphael has described, there has also been some actually really creative thinking, more creative thinking in the labor movement and among the labor bar precipitated by the labor law review around ways and measures for broader-based bargaining. And I think the thinking that has gone into that over the last little while has indicated that if at the start of this we hoped that there was a solution that would go across, there hasn't been, but I think there's been further development around different models. And as I recall, the Murray and Mitchell report addressed some of it around franchising as one of the first steps, and that and I think that work needs to continue even with the passage of the bill. I'll just want to touch briefly on the precarity in the public sector, and that it's absolutely the case that it's there both in terms of those higher paid, higher skilled jobs like the jobs in the university, but there is also a lot of that around lower paid work, and in particular around healthcare, so around home care. That's really a huge problem, and I think that problem gets back to the fundamental one as was discussed about a lack of adequate revenues. I mean, there's a distributional problem as well, perhaps. I'm not familiar with that, but I think inadequacy of revenues around the healthcare system and around public education are also big issues.
Okay, so there's really, the two questions. What's going on within the university sector and the public sector, and how do we solve that? And number two, this notion of how do we enforce labor standards and our council's the right way to go. Let me do the first one. I don't want to get engaged in a collective bargaining process here, because we could quickly get into that. But I think there is certainly no doubt. I'm an incredibly expensive person to have in the classroom. I'd like to think I'm good value, but there you are. And there are certainly many of my colleagues who are clearly much better value to be in the classroom because they're paid significantly less and they're worked a whole lot harder. And it is eminently unfair. And I think that gets us into the question, why are the universities like that? Certainly partly they're in that situation because there hasn't been enough money flowing in the university sector. They're partly in that situation because decisions have been made to flow that money in different directions. So over the last 25 years, the share of the university budget that's going to people like myself or to those sessional instructors has been falling down, and more of that money is going to administration, to buildings, et cetera, like that. And there's no doubt that's been going on, so that's part of it. But I think the bigger question here is one of relativity. And I come out of Windsor. I come out of an auto worker family. I've worked in the plants. My friends from Walkerville and Windsor, they went to what was called the University of Chrysler. And to be blunt, they've had materially a much better standard of living than I've had. By the time I did my BA, my PhD, and then I did a couple crappy jobs on contract as a professor, it took me 23 years to get back to the same hourly wage I was making when I was 17 when I was putting in spark plugs. So I think there's a question of relativity there, and some of that has kind of got out of whack. In particular, it's got out of whack because I think people at the bottom and millennials are bearing the brunt of our change in who's worth what. And I think that's what we need to address rather than saying I should take a 50% pay cut, and maybe I should. But I'm not sure I would agree to that collective bargaining position outright. Although I did have a dean who suggested that back during the Harris days, and we rejected that. The other issue here, though, I think is a more complex one. Is how do we get rights enforced at the workplace? And Leah's referring to an article where I made this wacko idea, or present this wacko idea, that really unions need to start thinking about controlling who gets employment. That's something that we gave away right after World War II, because the initial proposals of the UAW when they're negotiating with Ford was that the local 200 would determine who got employed at the Ford Motor Company. And the Rand formula and that decision there by Chief Justice Ivan Rand said, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to have is Ford is going to have to control who gets a job, but in return, Ford has to agree to share the productivity gains through the contract. And that worked quite well until the 80s. And now it's not working very well anymore because the employers are no longer accepting their part of the deal. They're not accepting their part of the deal to provide decent wages and benefits and protect workers, and they're completely controlling who gets the job, and they're fishing the workplace, and they're going to temp agencies, and they're going to freelancers, and that initial deal is not there. So my suggestion was, well, unions have to go back to the 1940s and say, we want to have control over who gets employment. In some ways, like elements of what the Mexican system has long been. That's probably not going to happen for a few decades, but that's another issue. So then the question is, can we use works councils in non-union workplaces to enforce labor standards? I'll be frank, I'm not optimistic because I think there's problems there because many of these people in non-union workplaces are on 6-month contracts. There are temp workers, and as I said in that article, I think for most workers now, they have not just a question of protecting their health and minimizing effort in the workplace. They also have a question of how do they get another job. So on the one hand, they're saying, I don't want to be overworked or killed at work. On the other hand, I'd like to have a job. And sometimes you've got to accept a little bit of this being killed in order to have a little bit of this having a job. And I think that's a reality. I'm not sure how a non-union council can get around that constraint. And even in unionized workplaces, I have a study that's going on right now about retribution on health and safety. And it's a problem there. Even if you're in a unionized workplace, you can be victimized for standing up and saying, because we're Canadians, please would you change the workplace because it's killing me. And that you can lose your job as a result. So it's a very big problem, and that I think needs big, ambitious solutions that will take decades.
So Andy's question and Wayne's answer about administrator makes me very uncomfortable now as a tenured professor and a dean, so I'm in really bad shape. So I want to, first of all, thank the panelists for really marvelous presentations, giving us a lot of both analytic basis for subsequent discussion and also some provocative ideas on what to do about it. So join me in thanking our 3 presenters.